At 95 years old, William Shatner has lived long enough to become almost inseparable from the character that made him famous. For generations of viewers, his name immediately brings to mind Captain James T. Kirk, the confident commander of the USS Enterprise who seemed to have an answer for every crisis. But behind that legendary image was a very different reality. The set of Star Trek was not always the harmonious family that audiences imagined. Behind the futuristic uniforms, heroic speeches, and stories about cooperation, there were tensions that would follow some of the cast members for decades. Arguments over screen time, disagreements about authority, strained friendships, and personal resentment created a complicated history that was rarely visible when the cameras were rolling. And now, decades later, Shatner has continued to speak about that period of his life. Some of his revelations paint him as ambitious and fiercely protective of his position. Others reveal something much more vulnerable. A man who spent his entire life being celebrated as an icon while remaining surprisingly uncomfortable with the person he saw behind that image. William Shatner was born in Montreal, Canada, in 1931. Long before Captain Kirk existed, he was simply a young man trying to find his place. He studied commerce at McGill University while becoming increasingly drawn toward acting. His path eventually led him to the stage, where one unexpected opportunity changed his career. At the Stratford Shakespeare Festival, Shatner was understudying Christopher Plummer in Henry V. When Plummer suddenly became unavailable, Shatner had only a few hours to prepare for the role. It was the kind of opportunity that could easily destroy an inexperienced performer. Instead, he walked onto the stage and delivered a performance that attracted serious attention. That experience revealed something important about Shatner. Beneath the confidence that audiences would eventually associate with Kirk was a performer who could be deeply insecure about his own work. Even after becoming one of television's most recognizable actors, Shatner would later admit that he generally avoided watching himself on screen. That may sound strange considering how completely his career became associated with Star Trek. But Shatner has explained that watching himself perform makes him uncomfortable. In other words, the man who became famous for portraying one of television's most confident captains was never particularly comfortable watching his own reflection on screen. Then came 1966. Star Trek premiered with Shatner as Captain Kirk, and almost immediately the role began changing his life. The series eventually became one of the most influential science fiction shows in television history. Shatner appeared in every episode of the original series, and Kirk became the character that would define an enormous part of his career. But success created a new problem. The bigger Captain Kirk became, the more important Shatner's position on the show became. And according to several of his co-stars, that influence sometimes created serious friction behind the scenes. Nichelle Nichols, who played Lieutenant Uhura, later spoke about her frustrations with Shatner's behavior on set. Other cast members also described a working relationship that could be difficult. Walter Koenig, who played Chekhov, eventually acknowledged resentment toward Shatner, while James Doohan, the beloved actor behind Scotty, also had his own complicated history with him. The central accusation was that Shatner sometimes behaved as though Star Trek was primarily his show rather than an ensemble production. Critics of his behavior pointed to disputes over dialogue, camera attention, and the balance between Kirk and the other characters. There was also the complicated relationship between Shatner and Leonard Nimoy. Kirk and Spock became one of television's most famous partnerships, but their popularity created an unusual dynamic between the actors playing them. Shatner was the show's central star, yet Nimoy's Spock became enormously popular with viewers. For Shatner, that could not have been easy. The two men were competitive, but their relationship was more complicated than simple rivalry. Over the years, they developed a genuine bond that survived disagreements, professional competition, and the enormous pressure of being permanently identified with the same television phenomenon. Even Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, reportedly became frustrated with the egos surrounding his two leading stars. A letter attributed to Roddenberry criticized both Shatner and Nimoy for their self-centered behavior, famously suggesting that they had divided the franchise's reputation for selfishness between them. But if Shatner's relationship with Nimoy was complicated, his conflict with another cast member would become something far more enduring. George Takei, who played Hikaru Sulu, would eventually become Shatner's most famous on-set rival. The disagreement went back decades. Takei later described Shatner as difficult to work with and claimed that Shatner often ignored him between takes. Shatner, meanwhile, rejected the idea that he had treated Takei unfairly and portrayed the ongoing hostility as something he struggled to understand. Then came Star Trek V: The Final Frontier. In 1989, Shatner directed the film, giving him unusual control over the production. One sequence involved Sulu taking command of the Enterprise. The scene was ultimately removed, and Takei interpreted the decision as deliberate sabotage. Whether that interpretation tells the entire story or not, the decision became another chapter in a feud that would refuse to disappear. Years later, the disagreement was still alive. When Takei married Brad Altman in 2008, the question of whether Shatner had been invited became another public controversy. The two men offered dramatically different versions of what happened. Shatner believed he had been deliberately excluded. Takei maintained that an invitation had been sent. Neither side accepted the other's explanation, and that was the pattern that would define their relationship for years. One accusation, one denial, and no final resolution. Yet there was another relationship in Shatner's life that would eventually matter far more than any Hollywood feud. Leonard Nimoy had become more than a co-star. He had become one of the people who understood the strange journey they had taken together. Kirk and Spock had survived the cancellation of the original series, returned to the big screen, and remained cultural icons long after many television friendships had disappeared. But in the final years of Nimoy's life, something changed. Their communication became strained. Nimoy stopped returning Shatner's calls, and Shatner later spoke about how painful that silence was. He said he wrote Nimoy a heartfelt letter expressing his love for his longtime friend, but never received an answer. In 2015, Leonard Nimoy died at the age of 83. Shatner was not there at the end, and that absence became one of the deepest regrets of his life. But Nimoy's death was not the only devastating loss Shatner had experienced. Years earlier, he had faced a tragedy that would permanently change him. In 1999, his third wife, Narine, died after being found in the swimming pool at their home. The circumstances surrounding her death were devastating, and Shatner later spoke openly about her struggle with alcoholism and his own helplessness in trying to save someone he loved. He had believed that love could be enough. It wasn't. That loss forced Shatner to confront a side of life that Captain Kirk could never have prepared him for. Grief without an enemy to defeat, without a mission to complete, and without a command that could make everything right. And somehow, instead of disappearing from public life, Shatner kept moving. He turned some of his pain into creative work. He continued acting. He explored music. He embraced projects that many people never expected from him. And eventually, at an age when most people would be thinking about slowing down, William Shatner did something that seemed almost impossible. He went to space. But before we get to the astonishing chapter that transformed how millions of people viewed him, there is still one question that has followed Shatner for more than half a century. Was the difficult, self-centered Captain Kirk image actually the truth about William Shatner? Or was there something much more complicated underneath it? The answer may have been hiding in plain sight all along. William Shatner had already lived several extraordinary lives by the time he reached his 90s. Actor Captain Kirk, Emmy winner, author, musician, horseman, and eventually a real-life space traveler. But the older he became, the more complicated his Star Trek legacy seemed. Behind the confident image of Captain Kirk was a man who had experienced enormous success alongside painful loss and controversy. His relationships with several former cast members had become complicated, especially his decades-long feud with George Takei. Takei accused Shatner of being difficult and overly focused on himself during the original Star Trek years. Shatner rejected many of those accusations, and the disagreement continued for decades. Even after both men were in their 90s, the old conflict occasionally resurfaced in public. But the relationship that mattered most to Shatner was his friendship with Leonard Nimoy. Kirk and Spock had become one of television's most famous partnerships, and over the years Shatner and Nimoy developed a genuine friendship. Yet near the end of Nimoy's life, something changed. Nimoy stopped returning Shatner's calls. Shatner later said he did not understand why. He reached out again and even wrote Nimoy an emotional letter expressing how much he cared about him. There was never a reply. In 2015, Leonard Nimoy died. For Shatner, the unanswered questions became part of the grief. There was no final conversation and no chance to repair whatever had gone wrong between them. Years earlier, Shatner had experienced another devastating loss. In 1999, his wife Nerine died after being found in the swimming pool at their home. Her death was connected to the severe consequences of alcohol addiction, a struggle Shatner had known about and tried to help her overcome. The tragedy changed him permanently. Instead of hiding his grief, Shatner eventually transformed it into creative work. His later music included deeply personal material about loss, revealing an emotional side of the actor that audiences rarely saw. Then came one of the most unexpected chapters of his life: space. In 2021, at the age of 90, William Shatner traveled aboard Blue Origin's New Shepard spacecraft. The man who had spent decades pretending to command starships was finally going into space for real. When he returned, he was visibly emotional. Looking down at Earth from above, he described the experience as overwhelming and deeply moving. For a man who had spent his entire career surrounded by fictional visions of the universe, seeing the real Earth from space appeared to change his perspective. He had played Captain Kirk. Now he had actually traveled beyond Earth. And somehow, even that historic achievement did not end the old feud with George Takei. Takei publicly commented on Shatner's flight, proving that some Hollywood rivalries can survive almost anything. But Shatner's life had become much bigger than that feud. He continued working with horses, another passion that had been part of his life for decades. Away from Hollywood, the horses offered him something his celebrity could not provide: a world where he was simply himself. He also remained involved with charitable work, including the Hollywood Charity Horse Show, which has raised money for children and veterans organizations over many years. These parts of his life complicate the simple image of Shatner as an arrogant Hollywood star. The truth is far more human. He could be ambitious and generous, confident and insecure, difficult and deeply compassionate. He could make mistakes while still doing meaningful things for others. Perhaps that is why his story remains so fascinating. At 95, Shatner had outlived many of the people who helped create the Star Trek phenomenon. Leonard Nimoy was gone. James Doohan was gone. Nichelle Nichols was gone. Yet Shatner remained, still working, still speaking, still creating, still surprising people. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson from his life. Fame does not protect anyone from grief. Success does not prevent loneliness. And playing a heroic character does not make someone perfect. William Shatner's story is much messier than Captain Kirk's. There were friendships, rivalries, regrets, achievements, and losses. There were people who admired him and people who never forgave him. But through all of it, he continued moving forward. The world may always remember Captain Kirk. But behind the uniform was William Shatner, a complicated, imperfect, fascinating man who spent 95 years building a legacy that no single role, feud, or controversy could completely define. The captain's mission may have ended long ago. William Shatner's journey clearly has not.